In the book, It's Not Inside, It's on Top, Khanya Mtshali looks at the role of advertising in our democracy and how business, politics and marketing intersect. She joins us live for more. Khanya, thank you so much for your time. Let's go through what inspired this body of work.
Thank you so much for having me on this show. Basically, I stood in the kind of role that adverts have played in our recent democracy. I wanted to kind of look at mass media as this archive through which we can track our social, political, and cultural history as a country.
Right. So, I mean, a lot of the adverts that you talk about brought back some serious, real memories. The Cremora ad, It's Not Inside, It's on Top. There was also Amak Look Look, and of course, not forgetting Chicken Licken and Joe Mafela. Let's talk about, the nostalgic feeling that one can actually go through while reading the book and balancing that with looking at some of these ads from an intellectual perspective.
Sure. I think that's a very important point because I think it's very easy to get caught up in the nostalgia of looking back on these ads and kind of remembering exactly where you were and who you were when these ads came out. So I think a big sort of goal of mine in terms of writing the book was to complicate our relationship with nostalgia, to kind of look at sentimentality as this fairly political thing, it's not divorced from the context in which it arises. So I really wanted to, embrace the nostalgia of these particular ads, but also criticize them insofar as possible and show that they didn't come out of nothing, that they were very much informed by what was happening in the country at the time.
I'm curious to know which was your favorite chapter to write and why?
I have to say the VW chapter was arguably my favorite because I think it allowed me to look at our trade union history and to sort of see how the demise of trade unions arise at a point when they were co-opted by corporations and later political parties. And then I also have to say the Sprite ad was one of my favorites because I looked at Joelle Kayembe, who I think is such an interesting pop culture study. She was one of the first swimwear Black models, and she was such a prominent face of the 2000s. And so there was an opportunity for me to look back on pop culture at that time and to also see, what that advert did and how, risque it was, and yet it was embraced by South Africa, which happens to be a relatively conservative place culturally.
When you were writing this book, in terms of the style of writing, how easy or difficult was it to go the way that you did? Because from my reading at it, it could easily have been an academic book, but in this particular case, you chose to make it very accessible.
Thank you. I appreciate that because it was something that I made a big point of doing. As kind of accessible and casual as the actual writing may be, it takes a lot of effort to do that because a lot of the book was informed by reading academic text. So I had to figure out a way to present this in prose that wasn't too tough, that wasn't boring. And that took a lot of work. But I think I really wanted to inject humor into it. I wanted to, kind of condense very academic ideas into something that, anybody could understand. I made a big point of doing that, but it wasn't entirely easy because, it's very easy to sort of adopt the tone and language of the text that you are reading to write the book.
Right. As a culture critic, when you look at the advertising industry from the VW ad right up until now, what would you say are some of the standouts in terms of how our industry balances, creativity and dynamism with reflecting what is really happening on the ground right now?
I think it's somewhat harder to reflect what's happening on the ground. And I also think, when you look back at some of these adverts, they weren't necessarily reflecting exactly what was happening on the ground. Oftentimes they were piggybacking off of, social movements, or perhaps they were just presenting a very corporate, sanitized version of what was happening. So I found that very interesting. But I think it's a lot harder because the world moves quicker and things are constantly changing, and you have, just different subgroups who have voices. Social media plays a role in terms of making it a lot for brands to just, represent people are thinking as easily as they were before.
Khanya, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. That is Khanya Mtshali, who's written the book It's Not Inside, It's on Top.